Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be tackling something really cool: random forests. You know, that machine learning technique that everyone's saying is even more accurate than those smart algorithms.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. What really grabs you about random forests is this whole idea of like the wisdom of the crowds. But instead of people, we're talking decision trees.
Okay, now there's a twist. So instead of just one decision tree, like we've talked about before, a random forest uses a whole bunch of them.
Exactly. Each tree gets to analyze the data, but here's the catch. They each get a slightly different, totally random perspective on it.
Hmm. Randomized data. It's like each tree is getting its own, what, like a slightly shuffled version of the data?
It is. That's a great way to put it. And then get this. Each tree makes its prediction based on what it sees, and then all those predictions are combined. Usually it's like a voting system to get the final result.
Ah, so it is like a democracy. Each tree gets a vote. But how does that all that randomization actually work? We just like shaking the data up like a snow globe.
Uh-huh. I like that visual. Well, one of the most common methods is called bagging. Basically, each tree gets trained on a random subset of the data.
So it's like dealing out cards, but each tree gets what? A different hand, but from the same deck?
Spot on. Exactly like that.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't that make each individual tree kind of a weak learner since they're only seeing part of the picture?
See, that's the genius of it. By themselves, sure, they might not be perfect, but the magic happens when you bring all their knowledge together.
Right. Like each one has a little piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. It becomes way more robust, way more accurate than any single tree could be on its own.
Makes sense. And because they've all been trained on slightly different data, they each bring a unique perspective, right? Like different ways of seeing the same problem.
Absolutely. But hold on, because it gets even more interesting. Random forests also use something called feature randomness.
Future randomness. Okay, now we're getting fancy. What's that then?
So imagine a tree is making a decision at a particular node. Right.
Like a fork in the road where it has to decide which way to go based on the data.
Perfect. You got it.
Yeah.
So at that fork, it doesn't get to consider all the available variables, only a random subset of them.
Whoa. So not only different data, but also different parts of that data they're focusing on, keeping things interesting.
Exactly. And there's a very important reason for all this randomness. It helps prevent overfitting.
Right, overfitting. That's when the model gets a little too comfortable with the data it's been training on, and then when it gets new data, boom.
Exactly. Like studying for an exam by just memorizing the answers, you might ace that specific test.
But you don't actually understand the material.
Exactly. So by injecting all this randomness, we force the trees to become more adaptable, to generalize better, to new data they've never seen before.
This is blowing my mind a little bit. So we're actually using randomness on purpose to make the model stronger. Seems counterintuitive, but I like it.
That's the beauty of it. A little bit of chaos can actually lead to better accuracy and more robust models in the long run.
Okay, so we've got our forest full of all these diverse, randomized decision trees, each with its own little piece of the puzzle. How do they actually stack up against the competition, though? Let's get into that, shall we? So we've got the whole forest of decision trees, each one a little bit different. Sounds good in theory, but how well do random forests actually, you know, perform in the real world? Do they live up to the hype?
It's a jungle out there.
Oh.
The world of machine learning. There's always some new algorithm popping up claiming to be the best thing since sliced bread.
Right. Always that next big thing.
Exactly. But random forests, they've got this remarkable staying power. They consistently perform really well, often even better than these other really popular algorithms, even the ones that learn as they go.
Oh, right. Like those algorithms that get better each time they make a mistake. I always found that concept so fascinating.
Yeah, those are powerful, for
Hmm.
sure. But random forests, they just seem to handle those curveballs that real-world data throws at you so well. Those messy data sets with missing values or outliers.
They don't get thrown off by a little noise.
Not at all. They're like surprisingly good at cutting through all the chaos and finding the signal in the noise.
Interesting. It's like that saying, slow and steady wins the race. They might not be the flashiest, but they get the job done.
I like that. And we're not just talking about one specific type of data either. I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen them do incredibly well across such a huge range of data sets, everything from like medical diagnoses.
Oh, wow. Like predicting diseases and things like that.
Exactly, predicting things like diabetes or breast cancer even, all the way to like image recognition.
Hold on now. Image recognition using trees. That's where I get a little lost. How can you possibly, like, teach a decision tree to recognize a cat in a photo?
Well, it's all about breaking the problem down, right? So instead of trying to make sense of the whole image at once, the trees focus on specific features or patterns, edges, textures, shapes.
Ah, so each tree is picking up on a different little detail.
Yeah. And when you combine all that knowledge, you actually can get surprisingly good results with image recognition.
It's like those spot the difference games, but each tree is finding its own little difference. That's pretty cool. But what about speed? I mean, you've got all these trees making decisions. It seems like that would take a ton of computing power.
That's a common concern. But surprisingly, random forests can be really computationally efficient, especially if you limit how many features are considered at each split. They can handle massive data sets with tons of variables much faster than you'd think.
No kidding. So they're accurate A&D fast. Okay, I'm sold. But what about dealing with different types of data? I remember back in my data analysis days, always struggling with categorical data, like colors or types of fruit, those non-numerical categories.
Ah, yes. Categorical data can be tricky. But random forests, they got a neat trick up their sleeve for those too.
Oh, do tell. How do they handle those?
Well, instead of trying to force those categories into numbers, which can sometimes lead to weird results, they use their secret weapon, randomness.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How do you bring randomness to a category?
So say you have a variable like color, right, with categories like red, blue, green. When a tree needs to make a decision based on that, it doesn't try to rank the colors or assign them numbers. Instead, it just randomly picks a subset of them, maybe red and green, and then bases the decision on that smaller set.
So instead of trying to compare red to blue to green, it's just flipping a coin and saying, okay, today it's red or green.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It simplifies things and makes random forests really well suited for data sets with lots of categorical variables, which, let's be honest, is a lot of real-world data.
That's true. So we've got accuracy, speed, and they can handle all sorts of data. But with all this complexity, how do we actually make sense of what's going on inside a random forest? It seems like it'd be easy to get lost in there.
And that's where it gets really cool. One of the best things about random forests is this built-in transparency they offer, unlike some other machine learning models that feel like a total black box.
Right. You have no idea what's happening under the hood.
Exactly. Random forests give us this really elegant way to peek behind the curtain and see how they're making decisions.
Wait, really? Tell me more about this. How do we get them to spill their secrets?
It's all about something called out-of-bag error estimates. It's like having a built-in quality control system within the forest itself.
Out-of-bag error estimates. I like the sound of this. Okay, break it down for me. How does it work?
So we've been talking about how cool it is that random forests can combine all these predictions from different trees. But what happens when, the information itself is kind of messy? What if there's no single thing that really tells you the answer? Can they handle that?
That's actually where they really shine. They're amazing at taking these, what we call weak learners. So variables that on their own don't have a lot of predictive power, and they can actually weave them together to find these hidden patterns.
Ah, so it's like taking a bunch of weak signals and then the forest kind of amplifies them, combines them. Exactly. It's really quite remarkable. You can have these data sets where each individual piece of information doesn't tell you a whole lot, but the random forest can still find those subtle relationships and come up with really accurate predictions.
It makes me think of those, detective movies where they have all these clues, but none of them seem that important on their own, and then suddenly the detective puts it all together.
I love that analogy. And here's something even more impressive. Sometimes random forests can actually do even better than the theoretical best performance of other methods when you're dealing with these weak learners.
Wow, they're like super detectives. But with all these different variables, how do you know which ones are actually the most important, like the ones that are really driving the predictions?
That's a great question. And again, this is another area where random forests have this cool advantage. They have a way of figuring out variable importance, which is basically telling you which factors are the most influential in making those predictions.
Okay, how do they do that? How do you figure out which variables are the VIPs?
So it involves injecting a little bit of randomness.
More randomness. I'm sensing a theme here.
Right. Well, we basically add a little bit of randomness to each variable one at a time. And we see how much that messes up the overall accuracy of the model.
Oh, so it's like shaking each variable a little bit and seeing which one makes the biggest splash.
Exactly. If we mess with a variable and the accuracy tanks, we know it's important. But if we mess with it and nothing really changes, well, it might not be playing a huge role.
I like it. It's like those old wanted posters where they keep adding details to see if anyone recognizes the person. So, any real world examples of how this variable importance thing works?
Well, remember that study we talked about, the one about predicting how Congresspeople would vote? They found that a single vote on a particular issue was actually super important in predicting a congressperson's party.
Really? Just one vote?
Mhm.
That's wild. So, what was the issue?
The specific issue isn't really the point here. What's important is that it shows how much insight you can gain from this kind of
Hmm.
analysis. The random forest isn't just telling you what's going to happen, it's giving you a glimpse into why.
That's amazing. It's like getting a peek behind the curtain of like a really complex system.
No.
So, what else could we use this for? What other mysteries could random forests help us solve?
I mean, the possibilities are really exciting. Predicting the stock market, understanding how societies work, all kinds of things. The takeaway is this. When you can combine diverse perspectives in a structured way, amazing things can happen.
I love that. We started by talking about decision trees, and now it's like this whole big picture thing. That's what I love about these deep dives. Always so much to learn.
Me too. And that's the best part, right? The more you learn, the more you realize there's even more out there to discover.